The idea of using Power Query parameters to rapidly change which data sources your tables are coming from has been around for a long time. What we're going to do in this video is to take that concept and extend it so that we can use parameters not just to change the data source, but to change the data type. So in this example, we're taking the scenario where we start a project by working with flat files coming from Excel tables, but when our database credentials are available, we then want to switch the solution so that we're working from live tables coming from a SQL Server database. So before we build this solution, let's look at the finished version. So here we've got 5 parameters. The first one allows you to choose either SQL Server or Excel. And as you do so, the source of all your tables will change accordingly. So I have 4 tables imported. They're now coming from an Excel worksheet. If I switch back to SQL Server, the same 4 tables are coming from a SQL Server database. So that's the purpose of our first parameter. The second parameter shows us the file path of the Excel workbook that we're getting the data from. And then we've got 3 parameters to specify the SQL Server database. First of all, the server, then the name of the database, and then the schema in which the database tables reside. So that's our 5 parameters. And then we have a function which uses all of those parameters. So we've got some conditional logic to check the source type, and then we use the values in the other parameters to either connect to an Excel workbook or to a SQL Server database. So in a blank Power BI desktop file, let's click on Transform Data to launch the Power Query editor. And let's begin by creating our 5 parameters. So Manage Parameters, New Parameter. And let's start with the Source Type parameter, which will allow us to dictate whether the data is coming from Excel or SQL Server. The data type will of course be text, and for suggested values we can choose List of Values and enter the 2 possibilities, which will be either Excel or SQL Server. And then we need to specify a current value. Let's set it to Excel. Next, let's specify the file path. So New Parameter, and we'll call it File Path. Again, the type is text, and this time we'll leave it on any value, and I'll paste in the path to the Excel file. Next, let's create the 3 SQL Server parameters. First of all, the server name, which is text. Then I'll enter in the name of my server. Then let's specify the database name. And in this case, our database is called sales_data. And finally, the schema. And in this database, we're bringing in some views inside a schema called PBI. That's our first step. We've created our 5 parameters. Let's click OK. And let's move on to our next step, which is to create the function which will use all those parameters to pull in the appropriate data. To write a function from scratch, we simply create a blank query. So new source, blank query, and let's rename the query Import Table. And then we open the advanced editor to write our function. And the purpose of this function will be to retrieve a single table either from the specified Excel workbook or from the specified SQL Server database. So let's call the function getData. And to write an M-language function, we begin by specifying the required parameters, which need to go inside parentheses. And in this example, our function needs just one parameter, the name of the table to be imported. So let's call the parameter TableName, and then we use the keyword as to specify that this is a text parameter. Having specified the input required by our function, we specify the output that it will produce. So after the closing parenthesis, we use the keyword as, and this function will produce a table, so we use asTable. Next, to specify what the function will actually produce, we insert the arrow symbol by typing an equal sign followed by greater than. And then we use the same let-in syntax that's been used in the main query. And the first thing we need to define is the source. But of course, the source will be conditional. It's going to depend on the current contents of the source type parameter. So we need to use a simple if statement. So we say source equals, and then we use if source type equals Excel, then we need to use Excel.workbook, and to specify the workbook we use file.contents, and to specify the path we simply make a reference to our file path parameter. So that's what we do if the source type is Excel, else the source type can only be SQL Server. So for our else statement, we need SQL.database. And this function takes two parameters, the server and the database. So of course we simply make a reference to our two parameters of the same name. So first argument server, and second database. So that specifies our data source, the container of the data that we're interested in. Now we need to navigate to the table that we want to import. So let's define a variable called output table, and we'll use exactly the same pattern. If the source type is equal to Excel, the Excel.workbook function, which we've used and which is being held in our source variable, produces a table of metadata. So the normal navigation from that point is to identify which row within that metadata table you want to import. And you do that by specifying the value for the item and kind columns. That takes you to a given row, and then on that row you expand the entry in the data column. So the data column contains all the tables that have been retrieved from the Excel data source, so you navigate to that table via the data column. So in our M-language code, we start by drilling inside the source variable, and we effectively treat it as a list of records. To specify a list, we use curly braces, and then to navigate to a particular row in that list of records, we use square braces. So that syntax will take us to a given row within our metadata table, and then to expand the data column of that row, we use square brackets data. So that's what we do if the source type equals Excel, and we use a similar statement for SQL Server. So when we use SQL Server.database, we end up with a similar metadata table and we navigate to a particular row of that table by specifying the schema and the name of the item. That will take us to the row, and then, as with the Excel metadata table, we then expand the data column to import the contents of that table. So very similar syntax. Else, again we start with source, and we treat the source metadata table as a list of records. We navigate to a particular row of that metadata table by specifying the item, which again will equal our table name parameter. And this time we then look at the schema column, and that of course will be pulled from our schema parameter. And then once again we get to the table by expanding the data column. So now we have a table, and we can now complete our function by specifying the variable which the function returns. And of course that's going to be output table. And then to finish off our query, we specify the variable which is returned by the query, and for that of course we simply use the name that we assign to our function, which is getData. So we created this query by creating a blank query, and when you do that, as you can see by the ABC icon, you have a query which returns a null string. So we've now changed that to a query which returns a function. So when we click on Done, you can see that our query now has the FX icon, so it's been recognized as a function. So we can now use our function to import our tables, and of course where we're importing them from is determined by the current value of our source type parameter. So I've got it set to Excel. Let's say in this scenario we start our solution and only the Excel version is available. So we simply input the name of each table. Our main table is called Sales, and click on Invoke. And that imports the sales table from our Excel workbook. Let's rename it Sales. Then we have Clients. And let's bring in a couple more. Products. Staff. And branches. So these 5 tables have all been imported from an Excel workbook, and now assuming that we have exactly the same tables, the same table structure in the SQL Server version, then at any time we can go into source type, switch the current value from Excel to SQL Server, and we'll now have exactly the same tables that come in from SQL Server rather than Excel. So that's it. That's how you use parameters to be able to switch your data sources from Excel to SQL Server. I hope you found that useful. If you did, don't forget to click on like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.